Hello, welcome to a video where I'll try to show how I fixed the broken pin issue on my Fanatec McLaren GT3 rim. I've only done this on the McLaren rim, but I would imagine that other rims are going to follow a similar pattern. If you want to see how other rims come apart, then go check out Barry at the Sim Racing Garage. He's probably done it first. A few housekeeping things first. I'm going to say Fanatec throughout this video. I know that some people say Fanatic, and if that angers you too much, then so be it. You can moan about it to me in the comments. Also, this video is just made up of a series of still images. I don't have the gear or the patience to film the whole operation with all the camera adjustments that would take, so I just took photos with my phone. That's why some might be a bit blurry, but they'll get the idea across. Thirdly, if you want to have a go at doing this, you're doing it at your own risk. You could break something, you could burn yourself with a soldering iron, or stab yourself in the face with a screwdriver. I won't be held responsible for any of that. I also won't be responsible for you damaging your kit if you screw up. One other thing, check that if you've got a broken pin, it's not still stuck in the wheelbase. I imagine it'll end badly if you do this repair and then try and jam a new pin into a hole where there is already a broken pin lurking. If you're going to try this, I'll assume you have some rudimentary tool skills at least, and it's not your first time holding a soldering iron. That said, it's not really very difficult if you're careful and take your time. It took me a couple of hours, including stopping to take photos. I've never taken a Fanatec rim apart before, so I'd probably be even quicker next time. Be ready to pause the video if you're following along. I'll try to keep the video short so it'll take you longer to do each step than it's going to remain on the screen for. Lastly, this is how I did it. There might be a better way. I'm going to order a new loom from Fanatec anyway, as you could only do this twice from what I can see on this wheel at least, and I bet it's not the last time that this will happen to me across the 3 rims that I own. Thanks have to go to Barry from Sim Racing Garage for his teardown of the McLaren rim, which gave me an idea of how to go about it, and also Redfirecracker, who has a couple of pages for different rims showing how it's done. I'll link both in the description below. It's inevitable that I'll ask if this video has helped you or you found it interesting, then please do subscribe to this channel, do the thumbs up thing, and feel free to comment or ask questions below. Let's get started. You can see the broken pin in these pictures. There should be 2 together at the bottom of the circle of pins, and on mine, the right hand one is broken. The first I knew about this was that I turned on my Clubsport 2.5 wheelbase, and instead of a solid ring around the button on the base, the light was going around in a circle. Then I noticed that nothing was working on the wheel. I pulled the wheel off, looked at the pins, and noticed that one was missing. I swap my wheels a lot, and whilst I'm always careful about how I do it, I've read enough on forums and Facebook to know that this isn't an uncommon thing to happen. I will get another loom on the way from Fanatec, but I know that this will take a while to come, and I had nothing to lose, so I thought that I would try and fix it myself. First up, on the front of the wheel, we need to remove the 3 knobs, 2 multi-position ones and the mode switch below and between them. These come off just by gripping hard and pulling straight. I set them all in the same orientation so it was easy to see which way they had to point to push them back on later. The red rocker switches have little rubber covers which just pull off too. I used a plastic hook tool from a cheap electronics repair kit that I bought from Amazon. You can use a fingernail, but don't use anything too sharp and puncture the rubber. Just ease it gently up and off. It's held on by the smallest part of the rubber being below the red covering of the switch, but it slides up easily over that. I brought a 13mm deep socket home with me from work to undo the nuts which hold the faceplate to the mode switch and multi-position switches, but it was too thick-walled to fit in the gap. So if you're getting one to do this job, then a cheap thin-walled one is probably better than a hefty good quality one. In the event, there was enough room to improvise with a spanner. Nothing on this rim is screwed tight. There's a lot of plastic involved, so we don't need to use a lot of force on anything. If it feels hard to do, you're doing it wrong. Just be careful not to damage the faceplate if you have to improvise like I did. For me, it worked out just fine. Underneath the nuts is a lock washer, which we'll have to take out too. Just tip the rim forward and it should fall out. The nut holding the plate onto the rocker switches is an 8mm one, and there was plenty of room to get an 8mm deep socket on to undo them. You don't need a ratchet handle or anything, they undo by hand holding onto the socket itself. There's a lock washer under the 8mm nut. Under the lock washer is a tabbed washer. Take a note of how this is fitted. There's a groove in the switch and a gap in the plastic of the faceplate for this to lock into. The groove on the switch on the right hand side points upwards, the one on the left hand side points downwards. Now we can undo the 10 Torx screws from the faceplate. They're just self-tapping screws and are not tight to undo and shouldn't be over-tightened when you put it back together. This is exactly the kind of fixing where hand-fisted gorillas will over-tighten them and strip the plastic thread. The faceplate just lifts off. The P and N buttons will fall out if you tip it, the rest should be held in place by the button caps, assuming that you keep them on. But just lift it off and set it carefully aside. This is what you'll see when you lift off the faceplate. It's possible that the little white squares that you see covering the microswitches could fall off. They didn't for me. If they do, just make sure that they're back in place before you replace the faceplate. The big plug in the middle of the PCB is the other end of the broken pin loom. We'll have to make some space to feed that plug out, but before we do that, we'll release it whilst the board is still firmly attached. I used a plastic pry tool just to loosen each end up a bit before pulling. It was well attached and you must not pull on the wires. Take your time with this bit and slide it out carefully. There are, I think, 7 small cross-headed screws holding the PCB to the wheel. We're not going to remove the PCB, so leave all the other connections attached. We're just going to undo the screws so that we can move the bottom of the PCB, where the loom attaches, enough to pass it underneath. We're undoing all the screws so that when we lift the PCB a tiny bit, it doesn't have to flex. That's all the lift we need, just a few mil. At this point you can turn the wheel over. The grips will keep the front stuff clear of the desk where you're working. It's possible you could remove the loom the rest of the way without removing the quick release, or the original horrible mount, but it would be a ball ache to do, so it's worth taking 2 minutes to pop the QR off. With a ball-headed Allen key it's easy to do around the collar, just undo the 6 bolts. If you don't have a ball-headed one, you might get in under the collar. Otherwise you'll have to pop the collar off, which means removing the snap ring and running around on the floor chasing the bearings which have fallen out. I'll leave you to work out how to do it, but it's not hard. There's a washer on the bolts, don't lose that. The QR just lifts off when you've undone the 6 bolts. Be careful not to damage any more of your pins as you lift it off. This will expose the pins. You can clearly see my missing one now. Undo the 4 3mm Allen bolts holding the collar to the wheel and take off the metal plate. Now undo the 2mm Allen bolt in the middle which secures the centre to the cover. You can lift the cover carefully off now and set it aside. This is where it will split from the body of the rim. You can now free the pin assembly from the rim. Mine had quite lumpy hot glue which needed releasing, but it wasn't hard. Don't try and pull it all out just yet. Remember, we need to get the big plug under the PCB. Turn the rim back over and carefully pass the plug under the PCB, moving the PCB as little as possible. You'll probably do a combination of gentle pulling on the pin end and pushing on the plug end, but don't stress the PCB or pull too hard on the wires. Eventually you'll reach this point where the plug is at the hole on the back of the wheel. I used some tweezers to twist the plug until I could pull it out. You'll have to remove the heat shrink around the wire. Do this slowly and carefully. I used a craft knife to slit it. You don't want to damage the individual insulation on the wiring. It's not made easy because of all the hot glue holding it on, but it should come away with patience. This is what you'll be left with. I then secured it to the edge of my desk with a bulldog clip, but if you've got a fancy pants soldering clamp stand thing, you should probably use that. I didn't get a picture, but if you look really closely you should find at least 2 pins which don't have wires attached to them. You'll need one of those to replace your broken one, and you can simply take hold of it with some tweezers and draw it out of the plug in the direction that the pins point. Hot glue might be holding it in, but you'll see what I mean when you do it. Desolder the wire from your broken pin. Use the minimum amount of heat necessary to do it so that you don't melt the plastic. It would then be easiest to snip the soldery end of your broken pin before sliding it out, forwards like you did with your chosen replacement. You'd need very fine cutters to do this, but it would be easier than having to remove all the solder so that it slides through the tight gap. I had to do the latter and it was a pain. It should come out quite easily once it's clean enough, or if you snip the lumpy bit off the end of it. This shows the plug now missing 2 pins, the redundant one that we've borrowed and the broken one now removed. This picture shows how bad my soldering is. We've passed the redundant pin that we borrowed from another slot into the slot where the broken pin was and soldered our wire back onto it. The pin will only slide back in the correct orientation, as there's a semicircle shape to it. You'll see what I mean if you look closely at the pin which was removed. So rotate until it slides in, then solder the wire back on. I then covered what I'd done in hot glue to stabilise it all. It should really have a heat shrink sleeve put over it as well, but I didn't have any. It shouldn't rub on anything in there, and I used lots of glue. But when I do it again, I'll definitely have some heat shrink to hand. Now we can pass the loom back in the way that it came out. Think about the orientation of everything so that the plug is bending the right way to go back onto its socket. We're not going to plug it back in just yet though, just make sure that it's looking good. We'll reassemble the back so that we can protect the delicate pins first. Settle the plug back into its hole, but don't worry too much just yet about being completely accurate with it. The next part will take care of alignment. Take the pin cover that you set aside and swear for approximately 2 minutes as you very carefully line up the pins with the holes. The pins are delicate and you don't want to screw up now, so take your time and make sure that you're getting the pins in the right holes before you snug it down. Secure it with that 2mm Allen bolt. Next, the metal plate and the 4 3mm Allen bolts. This is the part which ensures that it can only go on in the correct orientation. Now you can secure the QR back on, and if you had to dismantle the QR because it was the only way to get the Allen key on, then have fun making all the ball bearings stay in the right place whilst you refit the spring, collar and snap ring. Flip the wheel back around and resecure the PCB. Be careful not to trap the ribbon cable for the loom underneath it, and don't over tighten those screws. Just turn them until they stop and don't slip with your screwdriver and damage the PCB. With the PCB secured, we can line up the plug and push it home securely. We can now put the faceplate back on. Just have a look before you do and make sure that none of the little white micro switch covers have fallen off. Do up the 10 Torx screws and again don't over tighten. Put the tab washer back on the rocker switches. Remember the right hand one faces up and the left hand faces down. Then the lock washers, then the 8mm nuts. Do them up just finger tight with a socket. The rubber covers just slide over. I push them down into place with a pointed plastic tool. Don't use a sharp screwdriver or you could tear them, just be gentle. Don't forget the lock washers and 13mm nuts for the mode switch and the multi-precision switches. Then just push the knobs back on. They have a shape on the inside which matches the shafts of the switches, so line them up carefully before you push. All done. Plugged it back onto the base and it all worked fine. Hopefully yours would be the same. I hope that helps you out, especially if you need to fix it at short notice because it's not always fast to get parts out from Fanatec. Please do hit subscribe and the thumbs up button, it will let me know that you've seen the video and got something out of it. Do comment or ask questions below as well, I'll read them all and respond where I can. Cheers.